Hello and welcome to Burgundy Unpicked podcast. I'm Joe Muller at Corney & Barrow, and following the Bordeaux Unpicked series, we thought it would be a jolly good idea to apply this to the Burgundy on Primeur campaign season, which will be starting soon. And on this glorious December afternoon, I'm joined with Guy Seddon.
Hello.
And Bryce Fraser, a debut, our Operations Director and Managing Director of Scotland and North East.
Hello.
Welcome. Lovely to have you here.
Well, it's very kind of you to invite me to this salubrious occasion.
So, Burgundy 2023 will be here before we know it, and we thought we'd get a special one-off recording for Domaine Leflaive, which we are due to release next week, around the sort of 10th to 12th of December. And in anticipation of that, we thought it'd be good to have a little chat and a chinwag. The three of us are here because the three of us were present at tasting at the Domaine in mid-November, a cold, dark evening where we met up with Brice de la Morandière of the Domaine from the Leflaive family, and Pierre Vincent, the winemaker who is responsible for making and steering the 2023 vintage to what is a pretty awesome success. It was a good tasting, wasn't it? Large, long, lot of wines.
We've tasted at Leflaive for the past couple of years at about 6 p.m. So that makes for a sort of late finish to the day, and I think it was our first complete day of tasting in Burgundy as well. So yeah, it was cold, it was dark, and it was quite late. But being faced with a whole rank of Leflaive half bottles lined up on barrel ends was enough to revive anybody, I think.
Yeah, indeed. It is. You've got your first day and you sort of hit the ground running, and we had a very early morning tasting from memory, 8 o'clock on that Monday. And then to get to the evening, and it's about 40 wines, which we tasted.
I think it was nearer 47, to be honest, but I wasn't counting.
You didn't clock that, did you, guys? So I think that was
felt like fun. 47 to me at least.
Well, look, so let's start with the first question that's going to be on everyone's mind. 2023 as a vintage. Is it any good? Do you want to give us a little overview, guys?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes. It is a lovely, lovely vintage. We're specifically going to talk about the whites here, and we're obviously focusing on Domaine Leflaive. So, I mean, I do think it's a great vintage where the quality potential is extremely high. I think the first thing to say versus 22 is that it was a less easy season, and I think this is borne out by the growers that you speak to. And I think what has caused that sort of challenge in the 23 season, especially these two heat spikes that you saw at the end of the growing season, and there was one in August and one in September. The latter, at the very beginning of September, coincided with picking. And so that, picking is always the most important decision you will make in the season. But even more so in 23, it was absolutely crucial to pick at the right time. And depending on who you speak to, some people said, it was important to be early, and there was a period of rain which coincided with the heat spike. And some people said, actually, that rain was very welcome because it gave a little bit of freshness to the grapes. I think it depends essentially where your vineyard was at that point in time. Leflaive started pretty early, so they came in from the 29th of August onwards, and then from the 2nd of September, that was when picking really accelerated. So in their case, they were fairly classic in terms of harvest dates, but they were stopping at 2 p.m. in the afternoons because the temperatures were getting so high. And so it was a slightly different rhythm than we've seen in some years, but I think something which increasingly will be the case, that people will pick very early in the morning and then will have to stop at around lunchtime. But no, to answer your question, I think it's a very high set of wines quality-wise. I think the terroir differences that you see from plot to plot are very pronounced this year, which is great. Chevalier tastes very Chevalier. The Clairvoyant is supremely sort of expressive Clairvoyant, for example. And there were really good differences from vineyard to vineyard.
Yeah, I mean, I'd concur. I mean, the main takeaways that I sort of picked up on with our conversations and tastings throughout the time, that heat wave that came towards the last 2 weeks just before harvest began was crucial, because it really allowed the phenolic ripeness to catch up with the maturity of the alcohol ripeness and achieve a balance. It's I'll be honest, when I went out there, I wasn't sure what to expect because, again, it is another solaire year. It's another year of sunshine, but it's so different to 22, where you had these heat waves in a much earlier time in the growing season for longer periods, which had a very different effect. So here there's this unbelievable freshness that was within the wines that was retained. And I think because the heat wave came so late, that allowed that acid profile really to sort of meld into the style it has.
Yeah, and I think for me that was the absolute key to the tasting, was a previous expectation that it had been hot and that therefore how fresh were the wines going to be. But given it was a 6 o'clock tasting in the evening after really quite a long day, they were absolutely fresh as anything. They were absolutely superb wines.
Totally. And I think when you read, whoever's listening to this was probably doing a bit of reading on the 23 vintage as well, you will sort of read and hear and see that it's, compared to 22, it's a higher pH vintage, a lower acid vintage. So again, that takes you into a sort of, this is going to be a much more textural style. These are going to be wines which might have a sort of a riper palate and profile. But it's really not the case on impression, because just to sort of drive that home, the freshness that comes in these wines is exceptional. You really gives a buoyancy, and if they are terroir-driven wines, it gives them that sort of firm reflection of origin as well.
I was playing around, I must confess, with AI when I was writing the vintage report, which is in our brochure this year, and not because I was looking for it to write the thing for me, but I just as an experiment put in my tasting notes and totaled the number of adjectives. So I was looking specifically at the words white and yellow, which I think for me are a good indication of, respectively, sort of crunchy fruit versus slightly overripe fruit in some cases. And the ratio was 5-1 in terms of my number of uses of the word white to the uses of the word yellow. So I think that's a sort of good indication. I mean, it's a fairly sort of simplistic straw poll, but it's a good indication of the fact that there has been a very sensitive management of ripeness this year. And I then got a bit more geeky and put some of Adam's adjectives through it as well, which he'll be horrified to hear. Do have a read of the brochure for more details.
At some point, we must share that particular result, if we may.
Indeed. At a dinner, we can reveal. I think that's a good point, because, I was sort of going through notes. The fruits that we've had, they range from citrus to green to yellow to white fruit. So there's a real spectrum. And so there's not necessarily a homogenous style to 23's whites. And before we get on to Leflaive specifically, I just want to address something you actually touched on already, which is about the vintage stamp. And this is a vintage where I think it's quite easy to assume that the vintage stamp will take hold of it. And what I mean by that is warmth. You know, we had these heat spikes, but it's also important to note that the temperature differences between night and day were very, very significant. So it allowed, again, that acid profile obviously to be retained within the grapes. With this level of differences, it's subject is easy to believe that you think these wines will have a certain style, and it's not necessarily the case. And I think they'll be surprising, which will bring us on to Leflaive. So I think the Leflaive style, the house style, that sort of energy, that drive and verve is very present within the wines, but it's also about each individual vineyard, which shines through. So I think on that note, we should maybe talk a bit about the wines.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we started, as always, with the Mâconnais wines, and Macon Versé has been, since 2004, an absolute sort of core wine of the C&B range, and I'm pleased to say that it was on very good form this year. They have then isolated some single vineyard Macon wines, which customers of ours will be well aware of. So Monté and Chêne are the two single vineyards which have been carved out of the original blend of the Macon Versé. Both of those were showing extremely expressively as well. And I think, is a real testament to the fact that single vineyard concentration in the Mâconnais is a thing, and is definitely something which people are going to be increasingly interested in. The Macon Ige, I think, especially deserves a mention, because that, for me, is a sort of slightly fleshier take on the Mâconnais, which tends to drink early and very well. And then we moved on to the two wines that used to be called Leflaive et Associés, And just by way of brief explanation, there is a separate range of wines called Esprit Leflaive. And those two wines, which previously formed the Associé duo, have now been taken into the Esprit Leflaive range, all of which you don't need to concern yourself with too much, other than this is a name that you will see in another context, and we have just released the 2020 vintage of Esprit Leflaive. We are now going to be giving a preview of two 2023 Esprit Leflaives in the shape of the Bourgogne Blanc and the Auxey Duresse. So both of those will be in the main Domaine Leflaive offer. And then I don't know, Joe, do you want to talk about the main Domaine wines?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, just touching the Macon wines I thought were excellent, and we've obviously got a brilliantly loyal following of those wines since we've been representing them in the market since 2004. I loved Le Monte. I thought the precision and the sort of reduction that it captured is, for me as a purist, really sort of waves the flag brilliantly. But the Ige, if you like, that unctuous style is the one that is, like you mentioned, is the one to go for. Very briefly on the Esprit Leflaive, ex Leflaive and Associé. There's obviously two Bourgogne Blancs in the offer, which can sort of offer a little bit of confusion at times, but just to sort of, clear it up, there is the Domaine Bourgogne Blanc with their own holdings, and then the Bourgogne Blanc of Leflaive and Associé, which is through a partnership. And this may be controversial, but this year I actually preferred the Esprit Leflaive label versus the Domaine, which must be a first for me, because that's normally the sort of, one of the flag bearers for value and absolute stunning quality at a certain price point.
Well, it's a good testament to the Esprit wines. I mean, it's I think that's a good insider's pick.
Indeed. And I think with the Domaine, so moving on to the Domaine wines, we all sort of know the sort of the range now. There's the Pliny Village, then we have the Premier Crus, Meursault sous le Dordain, then with Pliny we've got the Clairvoyant, the Foulatière, Les Combettes, Les Pucelles, and then the three Grand Crus of Chevalet Montrachet, Batard Montrachet, and Bienvenue Batard. And I'm not going to go within each wine. I'm just going to give you my sort of immediate impressions once we sort of debriefed and left and reviewed our tasting notes. The Pliny Village this year is sensational. I loved the judgment in the winemaking, where it's managed to keep the reductive core of Leflaive, but it's got this florality and it's got this sort of wonderful balance. I wrote it's quite nimble on its feet. It reminded me of a sort of a fencer in it's got some attack, but it's got a lot of elegance and lighter on its feet in style. Then I have to give a real mention to Pliny Premier Cru Les Foulatières, because I think that punched above its weight big time.
Absolutely, that was my star of the entire show.
Oh, out of the whole range, out of all 47 wines.
Yep,
the bottle to take home.
Absolutely, that was the one I would take home.
For me, Foulatière can sometimes be a real peacock. It can be very exuberant and expressive. It was a bit more classical this year, I thought, but
yes.
in a good way.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, Guy and I, we were chatting earlier on that Clairvoyant and Foulatière almost had a sort of slight role reversal, where you've got the sort of the taut nature in Clairvoyant that's there. It was a bit more exuberant in 23, which I guess, the vintage character maybe has sort of coaxed it out that way. But the Foulatière was verve and energy at its core, but incredible power for Foulatière as well, rather than that sort of floral, sort of enticing grab that it can have. I think we do have to mention Pucelle. It was electric.
Yeah.
That was just unbelievably gorgeous from its nose through onto the palate. It grew in intensity, a lot of grace. I wrote it expanded its volume but not mass, which I loved. And then onto the Grand Cru. I think we might have all even agreed on which one may have been the winner in inverted commas.
Yeah, I'm just looking at my notes here. I mean, for me, Bienvenue.
Bienvenue. Got it.
It is unanimous. I remember the four of us looking at each other when we tasted Bienvenue, because it blew us away. It's the aromatics were incredibly well managed, and you've got to remember Bienvenue is all about chalk. It's all about that calcaire presence and minerality that runs through the wine. It's there from the nose. It's stony, it's chalky, and then the weight on the palate, because it can be quite strict at times. I think the the sort of slight generosity of the vintage counteracts with that to give it this perfect point of weight, but focus, of precision, and then this electric, fierce mineral drive, all again with this freshness that we mentioned earlier on. I scored it 19 plus, and that is a very rare score for me.
That's a high Muller score.
Score.
Just for context, Adam preferred the Chevalier. So, what do we know?
Okay, well, yeah. Unanimous in the room, yeah. I would also like to give, on that note, my second favourite personally was the Batard. Chevalier obviously is glorious in this vintage, and the three Grand Crus are going to make a lot of people very happy, and a lot of sellers will thank you for having them stored in there. But the Batard, again, talking about the way you had Bienvenue in that sort of normally quite taut aspect of a terroir style with the 23 components. Batard, it came off the nose that this was going to be generous and this was going to be rich. However, that sort of gourmand impression that was there aromatically is not the same as soon as you take a sip. There's this poise and there's this sort of almost harnessed feeling that it's reined in slightly, where Batard wants to be free and it wants to be that voluptuous sort of sexy style. It actually had a sort of quite joyful, playful side, but with a lot of energy running through it. So
it's really quite a different sight as well. I mean, if you go up that combe, and you see sort of on the way to Saint-Aubin, isn't it? And you see Chevalier high on the slope there. It's really exposed. And, sort of almost pure limestone as well. So it's a very different beast, I suppose.
Yeah, indeed. So, yeah, I think out of all of that, okay, so if you were to, so one wine that you could take from the tasting, if you were to get a nice freebie from Corny and Barrow, which one would it be?
Well, if it's a freebie from Corny and Barrow, I'll take the Chevalier, please.
Unbelievable. Straight in at the top.
I think I would take the Filatier.
The Filatier.
To be honest. I think the range, I think there are some real successes in just straight Macon Verze. I think the Poule de Village is really, really special. But if it was a freebie from Cornibert, yeah, I think Filatier for me.
Yeah.
Well, Bienvenue, I think, has to be mine. Although, is it 6 bottles of Bienvenue? If you give me 18 bottles of Poule de Village instead...
6 bottles?
2 cases.
That's
or,
rather greedy.
I'll happily take 18, 24 bottles of Polini possibly instead. But no, look, this is a joyous vintage for Leflaive, and I think we should probably talk about maybe why do we think that is. Obviously, the growing season we've touched on. The team at Leflaive has been consistent for a while. We obviously know, and it's public knowledge now, that Pierre Vincent, the winemaker, is going to be moving on. This is his final vintage. I think we can all say he has done it a huge service, a huge honour, and has gone out with a bit of a bang, because these 23s, for Leflaive fans, will be considered must-haves. And I think that will spread quite easily once the release comes out, that word.
I mean, I think the processes and the changes that have been put in place since 2014, when they moved to Diam corks and when Bryce really took over, that should be seen as a sort of change. It's a game changer in terms of the wines that the Domaine has been producing. Obviously, they had a great reputation from previously, but I think they've really brought the Domaine, the dependability of the wines, the aging potential, all of this stuff into a totally different league. And I do see 2014 as a bit of a turning point there. And I think you should be aware of the new cuverie, which is in place. They've got this state-of-the-art equipment, the cellar processes, the handling of the wines. Everything has been sort of reinvented from the ground up. And I think that is hugely impressive to have brought about this sort of landslide change within a relatively short number of years.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. The hot streak is, by all, certainly, a lot of the fine wine lovers that I know and are happy to look after, as Corny Barry does, the hot streak of Leflaive is very much continuing in 2023, and it's not going to go anywhere either. But that maybe brings us on to a good question. Mr. Fraser, how do you, in the market at the moment, how do we feel Leflaive is viewed? I mean, there's a huge amount of love for it, isn't there?
Totally. And it is still perceived as being absolutely top of the tree. The quality of what they've done over the last sort of 10 years or so is beyond compare. I think there's still a humility about it, which is also attractive. We have a lot of on-trade customers who will allow people to sample and use Macon Verze as a sort of entry into what Domaine Leflaive can do. But straight Pouligny Village and whatever, these are still really, really, really fine examples of what Domaine Leflaive are doing.
Yeah. And I think on that as well, it sort of segues into the pricing. I mean, we will be releasing this in a sort of 10 days or so. We anticipate there's a small increase in 2023 with Leflaive's pricing. I mean, ultimately, the good news is, the main message is that the pricing, we know will still stack up against what's out there in the market. The vintage is of significant quality. And it's almost, going back and touching on that hot streak, if you like, of Leflaive, with Pierre Vincent coming back, particularly with 2014, with Brice de la Morandière coming in and making all these changes, bringing in a new team. It saw, from 2014 onwards, it to get to sort of an apogee, which I still feel we're possibly haven't even summited yet. It's still ongoing. And because there's not many other domains have had this sort of big transitional jump, if you like, in their sort of recent history, anyone who's got 17, 18, 19s, 20s, 21, 22, you'll want to continue buying these 23s because it gives a very different profile to those previous years.
One thing I'd add to that, I mean, I totally agree with everything that you've just said, Joe, but the management of warm vintages, or these sort of solaire years, has been supremely good at Leflaive. And I'm sort of thinking in terms of the last 5 years. If you look at their 18s, I mean, that's a real standout vintage at the Domaine. And to have managed the sort of excesses heat-wise of 2018 so brilliantly, I think, gives us hope for climate change and for the, it's a phrase you don't hear often, but gives us hope for the future. And, the fact that Burgundy is capable of sort of harnessing this finesse and this terroir difference, even amid such high temperatures, I think is fantastic. And you see the same in their 20s, the same in 22s, and 23, I think, continues in that vein. So I think we can feel quite optimistic about both the team there and also their handling of these warmer summers.
And that optimism and that excitement certainly transfers over to the release. We are anticipating a very busy week at Corny and Barrow. It normally is. It's normally a very fun week to be selling, because there's a lot of people who want to buy these wines for the quality reasons, but it also, as we've discussed, it straddles all different levels, from that sort of the most inexpensive fine wine out there, we often call it with Macon Versé, up to the heights of Chevalier Montrachet. And it's a real pleasure to talk about the wines, especially once you've tasted them. So I think, that sort of brings us to a sort of a close on the 23 Leflaives, and unless anyone wants to add anything. And I think, why don't we sort of go out on a question? Have you had any Leflaive in the last sort of 12 months that wines that are drinking well now? So outside the 23s aside, is there something that people can be pulling the corks on in the meantime whilst they let these 23s age gracefully?
Well, something I opened recently at home, and I'm not going to go in at the top end, I'll go in at the other end. The Macon Ige 18, I think, is drinking beautifully. And I think this is something that you can open with absolute confidence. You don't need to cant or anything like that. You just pop and pour, and I think it's drinking absolutely beautifully. And as I was saying before, the 18s have been done to perfection. So that would be my pick.
Mr. Fraser?
We were slightly further upscale, actually, but that's because we had a board meeting lunch, and we had Pucelle 18, and that was absolutely off the charts good. It was just perfection.
Yeah. I'll give a couple of answers, because I just always do.
Because you drink more than the rest of us.
Put together, I think.
Clavaillon 16, I think, needs a very good mention. This is a wine that it over-delivers, because it's Clavaillon in its finest form, where we mentioned earlier, when you've got that sort of focus and precision. And I'd say 16 whites as a whole, I think, are getting better with bottle age. They certainly, I'm liking them more than I first did when I tried them from barrel, more and more. I think that sort of natural concentration from the frost has helped it along. Combet 16 is an absolute knockout. It's stunning in every way. It's balanced. It shows Combet's old vine intensity of fruit, mineral expression, but with a real texture as well. Combet can have this lovely weight to it. But with my monopole hat on, I have to say, actually, I was served a 19 Batard Montrachet recently, and from Magnum, and by Jove, it was stunning. There is so much energy. It's electric for Batard, but it's got that Batard charm, and that almost sex appeal. So yeah.
Very good, very impressive, Joe. Thank you. Just on your point on the Combat 16, I would echo that, and I would also say that Falatier 16 is a beautiful wine. And I think while we're thinking about Premier Cru's, I mean, it's worth mentioning that the quantities are down on the Premier Cru's this year. So even though the crop as a whole was similar to 22, which is a nice place to be, the Premier Cru's by proportion are down slightly. So I think if you are thinking in terms of orders and planning your attack, I think just be aware that the Premier Cru's are slightly smaller.
Very good point. Yeah, the Premier Cru's are down, and it's arguably probably where the biggest focus is as a sales base, really. And on that note, I think we'll sort of wind it down. This is the first of a series of Burgundy podcasts. We're going to be doing one on the vintage report very soon, which will be a special on the vintage itself, which obviously will go into the detail of the red and the white in more broad depth past Leflaive. And then we'll be doing lots of Domaine exclusive podcasts as well, as and when they come out. And we look forward to what will clearly be a fun campaign. There's going to be quantity. The quality is definitely there. And I'll say goodbye for me. I don't know if any of either of you chaps have got any closing remarks you'd like to put, but thank you very much for listening.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your first appearance, hopefully of a series, Mr. Fraser, possibly.
I do hope so.
Take care.